It's time to get started, and we've already formed a quorum. I now call the meeting to order. It's about the 3 regulations under the Road Tunnels Government Ordinance. And the first thing to do is to elect our chairman. So according to the procedures, we have to have a nomination and a seconder. So Mr. Chen Hang-pen, Mr. Frankie Yik, Mr. Yu Si-wing, you are seconder. Okay, I accept the nomination. So can I ask another member to chair the meeting first? Okay, Mr. Yu Si-wing, can you take over the chairmanship for the time being? Any other nominations? So let me count from 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. All right, no other nomination. So Mr. Yik, you've been elected. On the subject under discussion today, as I might be moving a motion in a moment, and if I need to do that, then I might need to have a deputy chairman who can chair on my behalf during that discussion. Okay, can I have a suggestion? All right, Mr. Yu Si-wing, any seconder? All right, Mr. Tony Chair, seconds. Mr. Yu Si-wing, do you accept the nomination? Any other nomination? So let me count from 1 to 3. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you. Mr. Yu Si-wing, thank you very much. Now let's invite the administration team to join us. All right, you can raise your hands and register your names for speaking. All right, I welcome to Mr. Choi, Deputy Secretary, and his team for attending the meeting. Before we start our discussion, I'd like to remind members that if you have any direct or indirect pecuniary interest with the 3 pieces of subsidiary legislation, please declare that before you speak. Over to Mr. Choi. Please walk us through the relevant legislation. Thank you. Yes, I'll be very brief. In the policy address announced by the Chief Executive in October this year, she announced that with regard to the tunnel tolls for franchise buses, those will be waived in order to ease the pressure on the franchise bus operators. And that means that the CE Council will have to come up with amendment regulations in order to amend the relevant legislation in order to amend the tolls to be charged on franchise bus operators. And franchise buses are mass carriers, and they play a pivotal role in the public transport system. And yet, the cost for franchise bus operators has been rising, and different operators are facing different pressure. Indeed, out of the 6 operators, some 5 have actually put in application to the administration for fair rise, and we are already dealing with that in accordance with established procedures. And with regard to the role played by franchise buses, we believe that they should not be charged a very high tunnel toll. And also for franchise bus routes, actually they have been decided by the administration in accordance with transport and also road users, and they are not determined by the operators themselves. And therefore, we believe that we can exempt the toll of government tunnels and also certain roads in order to ease the pressure on operators so that the public will be able to benefit directly. And under the proposal, assuming that we are able to exempt the tolls on franchise bus operators, individual bus operators, in their accounts will have to set up a dedicated fund in order to deposit the so-called savings. And then when they apply for fare increase, and the CE Council believes that there is a justification to increase the fares, then the relevant bus operator will have to use that to offset part or all of the proposed fare increase in order to ease the pressure. So for the passengers, the ultimate fare increase will be lowered. We also propose that there should also be a cap on the fund. For example, where there is no pressure on fare increase, the cap can be set at, say, 10% of the total revenue for the individual bus operator. And if that has already reached the cap, then any excess can be offered to the passengers as a concessionary fare so that the passengers will be able to benefit directly. And we propose that it should come into effect on the 17th of February 2019 for the two non-government tunnels, in other words, the BOT tunnels, that is the WHC and also the Thailand tunnel. In due course, the bus operators will also have to make sure that the savings would also be put into or deposited into the exemption fund in order to ease the pressure on future fare increase. And we would be looking forward to your scrutiny and would be more than happy to take questions from members. Thank you. Okay, the floor is now open. And 5 minutes each first. Mr. Tony Chair. Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, the present proposal. Who's the first? So I asked them to raise their hands, and they all raise together. They all raise simultaneously. Yes. My apologies, Mr. Tony Chair. Please continue. Well, Chairman, of course, the proposed exemption on franchise bus operators so that they do not have to pay the tunnel tolls to government tunnels and also BOT tunnels. That would ease the pressure on the commuters in terms of their traveling expenses. In particular, the pressure on future fare increase can also be eased, so I support that. But then the first thing that I'd like to know is, can you tell us how the fund is going to be operated? Because we are concerned about how the funds are going to be operated because they will be saving a lot of money. And also, with regard to the capacity of buses, well, in fact, they are taking up about 30% of the total public transport system. We are talking about some 4 million commuter trips. And there is indeed competition amongst the operators. And if bus operators can be more competitive, then in terms of competitiveness, if more people or commuters would use buses, then will they be able to cope? That's the second question. And the third question is, we are concerned that, well, given the fact that you're going to set up this dedicated fund, then administratively, will that incur extra cost? So in terms of manpower, will the administration have to have more manpower in order to deal with that? And fourthly, it may not be directly related to this with regard to tunnel tolls. So if the administration is able to make use of technology, then that would also help reduce the administrative costs. So 3 points altogether. In fact, you asked 4 questions altogether. Is about how the fund is going to be operated, and second is about set capacity, and third is about the fund operation, and fourthly is about the use of technology. On the operation of the fund and also the administrative costs for both the administration and the bus operator. In simple terms, well, the bus operator will have to set up this fund under their account, and so it's like a petty cash box. So when they apply for any fare increase, then generally speaking, the administration will have to look at whether or not they have justifications. For example, if they ask for a certain percentage of fare increase, then if we're able to see that, all right, there is money in the fund, and therefore the fund will be used to ease the pressure on such a fare increase. So what about monitoring? Well, in terms of monitoring, generally speaking, every year we will check the accounts with the bus operator. So we would be looking at their fare box and non-fare box revenues, and therefore we would be looking at the audited accounts of the bus operators to see how they're using their money, whether or not it's about their total revenue and also is about the use of the fund. So we'll be auditing their accounts annually. So we'll be using existing manpower. So as far as the administration is concerned, the Bureau and the Transport Department have been looking at the bus operators' accounts already. And of course, the bus operators already have their own manpower to deal with that, and therefore there is no need for any extra manpower. So can they use the fund casually because they have their own operation, right? Yes, that's correct. So they cannot use the fund for other purposes. They can only use the fund for offsetting fare increase. Or if there is no fare increase at all, and if the fund has accumulated funds in excess of the cap, then that would also have to be plowed back to the commuters because they are actually saving this on behalf of the administration. And the second question is about the capacity of buses. In fact, when we look at the bus operators and also the public transport system, there are certain challenges, and every year we do have a forward planning exercise with regard to route development to see if the routes are able to truly reflect the aspiration of the public, and also the carrying capacities of the operators will also be looked at. So we'll be planning together with the operators with regard to new routes and also existing routes and how they should be developed. So the Transport Department will be serving as a gatekeeper on the utilization of buses and also whether or not they have sufficient carrying capacity and so on. All right, you can only answer the next two questions in the second round. Next, Mr. Yu Si-wing. Chairman, I basically agree with this approach, but then there are some questions that I'd like to clarify with the administration. First, on the subsidy on fare increase, well, according to our past experience, after this has been done, and if the operator still applies for fare increase, to what extent are you able to ease the pressure? So the commuters will then know that, by adopting this approach, we'll be able to ease their burden. And also on the cap, so if it goes in excess of 10% of the total revenue, then the surplus will be returned to the commuters. So who will trigger this? Is it the administration or the operator, or is it that the mechanism will be such that, by a certain time when it goes beyond a certain amount, it will stop collecting, and then the excess will be returned to the public? And also on the WHC, all right, for government tunnels, is about putting this into this account or that account. But then for the WHC, you will actually have to reimburse the operator. So is it that for the WHC, there'll be no subsidy whatsoever, and then the bus operators' costs might go up. So the mechanism could be triggered, but then for the WHC, there should be no subsidy whatsoever. So can that be considered? Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Yu. In fact, in Appendix D to the paper, we have already provided some figures with regard to the tolls paid by bus operators to the government in 2017. Or in 2017, that was a snapshot. So it's about how much they have charged and also how much we have charged them. And therefore, in proposing this waiver, it's roughly that amount. And then when it's translated into their fare receipt, for bus operators, for fare receipt and also for their operating costs, normally that would be very similar, and therefore we have actually looked at the percentage of that. For example, it's about 2.32% for KMB. So roughly, we'll be able to offset the fare increase by about 2%. And of course, we will also have to check the details with them. But then roughly, that's the estimate. And also, if the bus operators are making a profit and there is no need to propose a fare increase, and if they've already accumulated about 10% of the total revenue, then we will ask them to return the excess to the public. And since we have to check the accounts with them, and if they have made a profit in excess of a certain percentage, then any excess will have to be shared between them and the commuters on a 50-50 basis. So that will be the established mechanism. But then as the fund will only have money that should have been paid to the government, and therefore 100% of that will have to be returned to the public.
For WHC, our proposal is to do the government tunnels first. If this is endorsed, then this will go into effect on the 17th of February 2019, and the fund will come into force without waiting for the WHC. For the WHC, members must be aware that we have the rationalization program for the traffic distribution among the cross-harbor tunnels, and this will also take into account the waiving of the tunnel toll, but that will be done as part of the rationalization program. And we will go ahead with the government tunnels first. The fund will be up and running. If there is any fare increase pressure, this will be offset. Mr. Yu, Chairman. Until we have the rationalization of the traffic distribution among the cross-harbor tunnels, will the government be subsidizing the tunnel tolls payable to the Western Harbor crossing? Deputy Secretary? Yes, indeed, Chairman. We're waiving the tolls for government tunnels if the rate of increase is justified in the views of the EXCO, then we will activate the fund without waiting for the WHC. Mr. Ben Chen. Chairman, thank you. This exemption is to exempt the toll for franchised buses, and the non-franchised buses are excluded. And the chairman, Mr. Frankie Yik, is going to move a motion which will get my support. I'd like to bring this up because if they get exemption from the tunnel toll, then the fare levels between the franchised and non-franchised buses would widen. And this is introducing unfair competition because franchise buses will enjoy government support and the fare can be reflected, and the non-franchise buses will have to suffer from a fare hike, and with unfair competition, with the playing field not being level, they are going to be eliminated very soon. Non-franchise buses will take up a very large component of the market, and they're playing a pretty significant role. Typhoon Mangkhut paralyzed the railway system, and the franchised buses who provided the transport for the people in the Northern District. It was the non-franchised buses that are providing the services. Now you are exempting the toll for the franchise buses, but to the exclusion of the non-franchise buses, you're not being fair to them. And you just want them when it suits your purpose. So I would like the administration to explain this. Also, the Lantau link, with the introduction of the two-way toll system, the traffic accident rate has increased on Lantau link, and all these statistics speak for themselves. We didn't have that many traffic accidents. Also, the motorists will have to stop and pay the toll, and it would waste quite a bit of time. It's not fair to the Tongchong residents because there is no option for them except to use that particular link. And this is the only route available to them. and they still have to pay for it. I hope that you would remove the toll for the Lantau link altogether. You have to take this step. Many residents in Dongzhong have been awaiting this for so long. They've been advocating for this to happen, but they seem to have fallen on deaf ear. How will the administration respond to the Dongzhong residents' demand? Mr. Chen, are you saying that the toll for Lantau Link should be removed for all vehicles? Indeed, Chairman. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chen, for the question. Non-franchised buses first. We fully appreciate, and we also recognize that in the transport system, the franchised buses do play a role, but the non-franchised buses also play an important role. We do communicate with the passengers and the trade, be it franchised and non-franchised, about the quality of service and so on, and safety. We haven't ignored them at all. However, the purpose of this exemption is to deal with the franchised buses as a significant component of the transport system. Their carrying capacity is the highest, and they use the road more than any other form of transport. So as a first step, we would like to exempt the toll for these franchised buses first. As regards non-franchised buses and minibuses, we would like to look at the entire system and see how much they should be charged, or whether they should be exempted altogether. And we would consider that. We will look into that. It's only in that context that we would consider whether the exemption should be extended. As regards the toll for the Lantau link, we heard members' aspiration, but the purpose of this amendment is in relation to the toll for the franchise buses. Dr. K.K. Kwok. Chairman, on the face of it, this is a good move to exempt the toll for franchise buses. In 2017, City Bus New World, they are making $100 million per year. Now, it seems to me that you're worried about them not putting up the fares. Now, you said the government is keeping an eye on their account, and this seems to me to be a fund for them to put up the fare. If I am a bus operator, I would just look at this amount of $200 million and put up the fare. Now, these cross-harbor tunnels, they are very profitable. They are favored by all operators, and per kilometer, they are making an awful lot of money, and they are pitching the fare according to the market demand. I think it is counterintuitive. If you try to subsidize the expenditure, then I think you ought to subsidize the students. They should be enjoying half fare for the public transport. Also, the elderly people, the disabled, they're enjoying some fare concession. The key thing is that they are achieving savings. It makes sense to subsidize the underprivileged and the students. It would be hard for people to get the $400 in terms of transport subsidy, and for the underprivileged, if they're not hitting the limit, they would stand to benefit absolutely nothing, not even a penny. It is counterintuitive. Second, this will only add to the congestion at the cross-harbor tunnels, in particular cross-harbor tunnel. In the morning, on the Hong Kong side, on the Kowloon portal, there is a long queue of buses extending all the way to the Hong Kong bypass. Now, for the bus operators, this is the most profitable route, and you are doing this to their liking. The government is daft enough to introduce this. I'm sure that WHC, Thailand Tunnel, they are used by KMB very often. KMB is San Hong Kai's. Thailand Tunnel, it is also owned by San Hong Kai. The government is really beyond a remedy in the daftness. If you want to relieve the fare increase pressure, if you want to improve the comfort on the buses, you have an awful lot of options. Why do you set up these dedicated funds to facilitate their fare hike? What is the logic? Right. DS, will you tell Dr. Kwok something about the monitoring mechanism? Yes, I was going to answer this. Let me say something about the dedicated fund account. I think we have to be fair. The franchise bus operator is monitored by the government. I'm asking you the logic. Yes, the logic is very simple. As a matter of fact, the bus operators, if you follow this New World First Bus and City Bus, they haven't had any fare hike for the past 10 years, and they are likely to go into the red. It's only against this background that fare hike is approved. We do have an established mechanism for fare hike. The Chief Executive in Council would have regard to a whole host of factors before fare hike would be approved. It's just because there is a fund doesn't mean that they will be granted automatic fare hike. If they don't need any fare hike, the fund will accumulate, and beyond a certain level, the money will be redistributed to the passengers. As I said in answer to Mr. Yu's question, the money is 100% government's money. It is parked there in their fund, and in terms of auditing, we will monitor the fund. We will not allow the bus operators to use the fund frivolously. Now, for tunnel tolls, I must explain this. Their routings, the frequencies, they have to be approved by the Transport Department. Just because of the exemption of the tunnel toll doesn't mean that they will deploy more buses to these routes. It doesn't happen like that. If there is an increase in the patronage, we will allow them to deploy additional buses to serve the commuting public. Waiving the toll doesn't add to the tunnel congestion. Dr. Kwok, there are so many options to assist, including the students. Why don't you do something about it? Right? You might wish to queue. Mr. Jeremy Tam. Chairman, my question is very straightforward. In the paper Appendix D, all these amount to $280 million. If you look at the expenditure, the tunnel toll as part of the expenditure is about 3%, to a larger and lesser extent between the operators. Now, and New World First Bus seek 12% fare hike, KMB 8%. At least a percentage is not the same across the operators, and they are talking about 3% as a part of the overall expenditure. But whatever angle you look at it, this 3% would be offset very easily. Now, if they don't put up the fare, then you're going to have a 30% accumulated in 10 years' time. Now, my question is, since you have this fund, the bus operators are holding on to this amount of money. When they seek a fare hike or whatever percent, the CE in council may not agree with the 12%. Maybe they would like to keep it at 8%, for instance. But that would allow them an opportunity to say that there is so much money sitting in the fund, and as far as the members of the public are concerned, it does amount to a very little amount.
In other words, without this dedicated fund, all right, if they want to raise their fares by 10%, you can say that, well, I will only allow 8% because that's about the passengers' affordability. But then with this fund, they would say that you should have allowed me to increase it by 12% because you can deduct 3% from that by using the fund. So in the end, the public will have to see the fare risen by 9%. Well, of course, we know how the fund is going to work, but then 5 or 10 years down the road, we don't know who's going to be the next chief executive. And then they'll all feel that, well, when they ask for fare increase, well, in fact, this fund will genuinely be able to offset part of the fare increase because the pressure will then be eased, and therefore they should allow the operator to increase the fare by a higher margin. So how are you going to make sure that this is not going to happen? So how are you able to tell them that, well, let's be clear about this because this is the way how it should have worked? Okay, so can you explain whether or not this scenario will indeed happen? Well, yes, Mr. Tam, that's the way it works. But then the only point that I'd like to add in order to reassure Mr. Tam is that in dealing with any fare increase application from the bus operator, first, we will not consider the fund and how much it has accumulated. So we will first consider the justification for the fare increase application, whether or not it's justifiable. And then there is a basket of factors, and that would also include affordability of the commuting public. And of course, costs will be one of the considerations, and whether or not the replication is justified. So we will try not to take into account that with the operation of a fund, in fact, the public might be able to sustain a higher fare hike. So we will not be doing that. In other words, what Mr. Tam described just now simply will not happen. So it's not about increasing the percentage of increase. All right, they're asking for 12%, and then in the end, they would only have to increase by 8%. Okay, with the funds there. Okay, if they ask for 12%, and then you might say that there is no reason why you should increase by 8%. So if you look at it the other way around, in fact, they will still have to pay 8% more. So how are you going to explain very clearly in your documentation that this is not going to be one of the considerations? So in considering whether or not and how much they would be allowed to increase their fare, that fund will not feature at all. So can you confirm that? Yes, I can confirm. So in fact, I can also confirm that given my experience, that has never happened. In fact, to use the example cited by Mr. Tam, okay, they asked for 12%, and then we proposed that only 8% should be allowed. And if the use of the fund would lower that increase by 2%, then the public will only have to pay for a 6% increase. So that's the way we consider it, and that's the way it's going to work. Okay, next is my turn. My question is very simple. To follow up on Mr. Chen Hangpan's question, all right, after the policy address announcement, I already expressed my views, and of course, I welcome this scheme because that would ease the burden on the commuters. But then Mr. Chen also talked about the non-franchise buses. In particular, I'd like to emphasize the residence services. I'm not talking about all services. The reason why we have these resident services, because during peak hours, if you ask the bus operators to provide the service, or during non-peak hours, a lot of the assets will be wasted if they were to provide such resident services. That's the reason why we have such resident services, and that would also provide convenience to the commuters. So the nature is very similar to the services provided by the franchise bus operators, and therefore, in my view, resident services should be covered. And the next thing is about GMBs, green minibuses, because when they cross, very few of them would cross the tunnels, for example, the Chiang Tunnel and also Lion Rock. So the percentage would be very small. But then it's a matter of principle, and therefore I propose that they should be covered. And you said that you'd go for the the franchise buses first. I don't agree. I think you should deal with that together, because as Mr. Chen just said, for non-franchise bus operators or services like residence services, it's not fair to them, and they'll lose out. Indeed, when you submit policy papers, you would say that you'd like to maintain this ecology and also the balance in the ecology. But then I'm saying or telling you that if you are not going to cover GMBs and our resident services, then the balance will be tipped. Yes, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chen, for raising this point about non-franchise buses and also GMBs and so on. The administration has heard the voice, but then, as we said, on this occasion, we'd like to go for the franchise bus services first, and the reasons are several. First, indeed, this is the biggest mass carrier in terms of road transport, and is most efficient and effective, and the number of passengers is the largest, and also the fares involved would also be higher. And in terms of competitiveness of non-franchise bus services and so on, I'm sure Mr. Chairman and Mr. Chen would understand that for resident services and also non-franchise bus services, if it's not GMBs, if it's RMBs, then if you look at their fare adjustment mechanisms, they are somewhat different from the franchise bus operators. Well, for franchise bus operators, we'd like them to set up this fund, and we are quite sure that the savings from paying government tunnel tolls, 100% of that will be returned to the public. But then for non-franchise bus services and also RMBs and so on, we are not that confident, and we simply do not have that kind of control. But then it's not that we're not going to consider it at all. We'll consider that at the next stage. And as the Chair and Mr. Chen have said, in terms of competition and also complementariness, we will be considering that later. So it's not that the bus operators will be able to lower their fare directly. In fact, the logic for any fare adjustment for franchise bus operators, if you look at their operations, we will have to look at the overall operating cost for the operators, and therefore when there is any fare reduction, it's not about one single route, because that will be translated into the overall operating cost of the operator, and any fare reduction will also be done correspondingly, and therefore there is no question of the franchise bus operator having a direct competition with GMBs and resident services and so on. And therefore, to a certain extent, the logic is such that if we were to waive any government tolls and so on, we should be looking at the operators, and we should be looking at their overall operating costs, because in considering their fare increase proposals, we would also be looking at their overall operating costs. All right, I understand what you're saying, but then what I'd like to tell you is that for non-franchise bus services, in particular the resident services, I don't think that should be dealt with in the same breath as franchise bus operators. They've already promised that they are going to directly reflect that in their fare if you're going to waive their tunnel tolls and so on. And they are also directly subject to your monitoring and so on. And therefore, I hope that you can consider it. Next, Mr. Wu Chi-wai. Thank you, Chairman. Well, the law itself has nothing to do with the fund, because that's an agreement between the administration and the franchise bus operators. So it's about how the reimbursement should be used for. So I'd like to say something about the proposal to set up this fund for the reimbursement from the administration to the franchise bus operators on tunnel tolls and so on. Well, for the refund, if it's to be deposited into the dedicated fund, and then the operator will have to apply for any fare increase as if there's no such fund at all. But then you're actually reminding the public to remember that, all right, with the fund's operation, instead of increasing fare by 8%, you're able to see that reduced to 6 or 5%. So is that really that meaningful? Or is it that the administration would just like to take the glory for that or credit for that? And my direct impression is that you're actually waiving the tunnel tolls only. But then for any cross-tunnel or cross-harbor routes, the most costly part would be going through the WHC. In particular, if any bus routes go through Route 3 and so on, the cost would be the highest. And there have been complaints about the long-haul routes. There should be serious consideration on the difficulty encountered by those residents living in those districts, and therefore their burden should be eased. And if you can focus on the operating costs for the tunnel operators, according to your present proposal, there would be a direct reduction. And if you can look at that, and then for routes running through these areas, there will be a more hefty reduction. Well, if we look at your present proposal, we cannot blame you for not doing the right thing, but then you should understand where it hurts most seriously. That is the residents living in those areas. In particular, for the New Territories routes, there is an opportunity for you to rationalize the whole thing, because the cost has come down very substantially, and a certain proportion has been put into paying tunnel tolls. And therefore, when you consider the idea of setting up dedicated funds and so on, I don't know whether or not there will be future opportunities for us to discuss this, because this is the only time when you're going to discuss this with you. But then will there be further opportunities for us to discuss how the funds should be set up and how they should be used? Because I do have very strong views on how the fund should be set up, because I think there is something to be desired. And second, I'd like you to provide some information. Okay, if we were to take out the element of the tunnel tolls, and if we were to benefit the commuters directly, so for any tunnel-related routes, in other words, if the routes are going through these tunnels, if there can be a direct cut on their fares, then that might be better. Well, if you evenly distribute it across the board by looking at the operating costs of the bus operators, you might only be able to reduce that by a smaller margin. Yes, Mr. Choi? Yes, I'd like to go back to the logic, because Mr. Wu is suggesting that we should directly reduce the fare for certain routes and so on. Well, we have indeed considered that option. And in the end, the reason why we have preferred this to that, well, in fact, the setting up of a fund is not something that we need to deal with under this exercise, because that's an agreement between us and the bus operators, and therefore there is still opportunity for us to fine-tune how it's to be operated. And the reason why we are not proposing that that should be done on a case-by-case basis or route-by-route basis, because in considering this, we have actually not considered whether or not the route has gone through a certain route. I can give you an example. For example, for Tin Shui Wai to Kwun Tong and also Tuen Mun to Kwun Tong, we have 269C and also 258C. All right, they both charge $18.4, and they go through very much the same route. One would be going through the Tai Lam Tunnel and the other would not. So if the cost saving would only go to the one going through the tunnel, that's wrong, because from the very beginning, the tunnel toll is just part of the operating cost of the operator. It's not that they're going to charge more for those going through the tunnels, and for those not going through the tunnels or passing through the tunnels, they are charging less. And therefore, for routes that do not pass through the tunnels, in the past they have not overcharged at all, and therefore it's not fair. And we believe that if we were to adopt that approach, that's not feasible. We cannot just say that simply because a certain route goes through a particular tunnel and therefore the fare should come down. It's not fair. We can provide further information to you after the meeting because we have already done some research on this. Well, they have already clarified the idea. I'd just like to supplement on what I said. I'd like to take the opportunity to look at the overall situation, in particular for the long-haul routes. We have argued about that for a long time. All right, maybe you should wait for another occasion.
Next, Mr. Tony J. 4 minutes. 2 more questions that remain unanswered. Right. To give you a reminder, administrative cost. What about application of technology? Yes, Chairman. Application of technology. I'm sure Mr. J is not merely talking about buses. The THB and the TD are considering the employment of new technology in new tunnels to facilitate the passage through the tunnel, and would like the vehicles to drive right through without any toll booths. We will come back to talk about this with members on other occasions. Indeed, we will consider the new technology. Mr. J, of course, this is not a subject for today. I hope that you would have a timetable. Now, you keep saying that you're going to do it, and we are lagging behind. We're trailing in the dust compared with other jurisdictions. How can we be a smart city? Now, in terms of the fund, the monitoring and the operation, you have already explained that a moment ago. With the introduction of this fund, and it is likely that the government will incur a lot of money to monitor the fund. I am therefore concerned about the manpower. According to the paper, you are going to use the existing manpower. Have you already increased the manpower in anticipation of this fund being introduced? Or are you going to add the manpower? We are concerned about how the money is going to be used. With the money saved up there, will it be just sitting there? Interest rate may be low, but we can still make the money work for some returns. This will only benefit the traveling public. As councillors, now we are really concerned about taxpayers' money, and only rightly so, and I hope that the administration will set our mind at ease that there will be good enough supervision and the money is going to be well spent. DS, Chairman, about the administrative costs and the worry about this eating into the fund, we can confirm that the TD has increased some manpower for their work, and there are 3 colleagues who are looking at the bus operators' account, not just this particular fund. We check their accounts and so on. These personnel will be in charge of that, and the money will not be taken off the fund. We will not take any money off the fund for administrative purposes. And this amount of money will be there to benefit the commuters. Now, we have to review our procedures to make sure that there will not be any redundant work. But in the meantime, we have to do proper accounting and audit work. Mr. J, if the money is not used for the time being, how will you make sure that the money is properly used for returns instead of sitting there idle? Yes. The money is entrusted with the bus operator. We will consider how best we can utilize the fund. We do have the accounting procedures to make sure that they will not be used for their own purposes. And this will be only used for the purposes to benefit the public. But that much I'm not worried. There are two members who are not here. Mr. Yu Siwing, Chairman, I am asking about the green minibuses and the non-franchise buses. These are the estate coaches. Green minibuses, they are running on designated routes. The DS said that these two will not be considered at the moment. By implication, you will consider them in future. For the time being, you're not considering them. Is it because of technical reason, or what reason can you cite for not considering them for the time being? Yes, I'm interested in this question as well. Yes. Now we are dealing with the franchised buses first because they are the largest component in terms of public transport, and the exemption will benefit the traveling public direct. Non-franchised buses, GMB, red minibuses, they will not be excluded. We will consider them at the next step. And they do have their own unique roles. For the non-franchised buses, they don't have that many routes. And I agree with the chairman that they do enter into an agreement with the residents about their fare level. I don't think I can exempt only those that are prepared to reduce the fare. Either I exempt them or I don't exempt them. So there are these considerations to be taken into account, and we're not dealing with this in this context. The THB and the TD will consider the balance in the public transport landscape. We haven't forgotten about the green minibuses and the red minibuses, but it would be rather hard because of all the technical difficulties. Now, for the congestion charge, we will consider that, and we will consult the sector and the members of the public. We'll deal with this in that context. Mr. Yu? Well, we have to have a level playing field, Chairman. I don't think the government should be skewed in favor of the franchised buses to the exclusion of the non-franchised buses or the green minibuses that are also serving the members of the public. The DS said this will be considered. Don't you have a timetable? Or are you just saying that you're merely conducting a study? You're sitting here today, and you will be promoted in future, and whoever takes over from you may do something else. Yes, Chairman, I don't think I can come up with any timetable because this is not something for me alone. But I can confirm that we are concerned about the level playing field. And with regard to this fund, we are trying to offset the rate of increase. And there is a bit of time for us to consider the non-franchise buses, in particular those that are serving the residents. For the green minibuses, as Chairman said, they hardly ever go through the tunnel. For the red minibuses, the problem is that their fare is not subject to any regulation. Of course, you may say that to reduce operating costs would be better to someone, but who will benefit most is hard to say. But in terms of the congestion charge, we will definitely take this into account. It's my turn next. Also on the same question, I was asking for the non-franchised buses. We are talking about those that are serving the housing estates. We are also talking about the green minibuses. We never talked about the red minibuses. I heard what you had to say, but still I would be moving my motion. It is only an indication of our stance. It will not be binding because there is a charging effect. I don't have the ability to move any private member's bill, but I hope that the administration would consider this arrangement going forward. Mr. Andrew Wan, 5 minutes. Very simple, Chairman. Like members, I don't have any trouble with the amendment. I am more concerned about the operation. Following on from Mr. Uchiwai's question, that the bus fares vary depending on the distance of the route, and this would have different impacts on the commuters. Will there be any different levels of subsidy in terms of the long haul and short haul routes? Yes, I defer to the TD regarding the fare decision. But the fare is decided upon in accordance with the distance and not in accordance with whether they use the tunnel, because the routings are mandated by the government. It's got nothing to do with the fare decision. And I think for the exemption, it has to be across the board. We would apply a percentage. In other words, for a long haul route, the fare is higher, and based on a fixed percentage, they would enjoy a higher reduction. Perhaps I defer to the TD regarding how the fare is fixed and why we consider this fund proposal is the best. Chairman, when the bus operators are seeking a fare hike, they do have a fare scale. Like the DS said, it is with reference to the distances, and they would adjust according to this fare scale. Now, of course, we have some long haul route and some short haul routes. Let's say Tuen Mun, Yuen Long, one is going through the Thailand tunnel, going to Kwun Tong. They would charge the same fare, and they would consider a whole basket of factors. Now, they look at the distances without having full regard to the tunnel toll. Now, with regard to this fund, let's say we are merely subsidizing the route going through the tunnel, then the other route would end up being high in terms of fare. Mr. Wen, Chairman, this is the uniqueness of the franchise. Well, unless you have any further questions, let's put it to the vote. This has been made available to members. I don't propose to read it out. Vice Chairman, will you please take over from me for the time being?
All
right, we're dealing with Mr. Frankie Yick's motion. Do we agree to deal with this motion? Right? All agreed? Mr. Yick? Right. It's been put on the screen. Will those in favor please raise their hands? Unanimously? The motion is carried. Mr. Yick. Please.
All
right, let me put this to members. Do you see the need to invite deputations for these three amendments? No? Okay, then let's proceed to clause by clause. Ms. Yip. There are three notices, 237, and there's Road Tunnels Government Amendment Number 2 Regulation 2018. The first one is the commencement. This will go into effect on the 17th of February 2019. The second one is to add clause 4, buses in respect of which a franchise is enforced under the Public Bus Services Ordinance are exempted from the operation of subsection 1, and accordingly no toll is payable for their use of the tunnel.
Yes, Dr. Kwok. Sorry, I wasn't here. Yes, I understand that you've already moved on to the clause-by-clause examination. But then with regard to the government's approach, I said that there are alternatives. For instance, the money may not have to be passed on to the operator. We can just set up a fund by calling it a fare increase fund. I think the most stupid one would be the administration in adopting this approach. So should you have given that to those most in need, including students and also commuters who have to ride on long-haul routes, for example, Tongchong, Tin Shui Wai, Yuen Long residents? Well, these are the people who are most in need. So if we were to set up this fare increase fund, is quite stupid. So can you first answer the question before we move on to the clause-by-clause examination? Sorry, Dr. Kwok, we have already started the clause-by-clause examination. All right, I don't mind. If you don't answer my question, I can just work on the wording of the amendment regulation. But then what you're proposing does not have any direct bearing on the proposed legislation here. You should have brought it up at the transport panel. That's my view. So can you just ask him to answer the question? All right, we do have time left today, but then I think for the clause-by-clause examination, can I propose that we complete that first, and then for the issue that you brought up, which is not directly related to the amendment regulations that we are deliberating today, can that be left until after the clause-by-clause examination? Well, it's up to you. I can ask questions concerning the clause-by-clause issue. Yes, let me attempt to answer the question. In fact, well, Mr. Wu Chi-wai already asked whether or not we could directly reduce the fare for long-haul routes, in particular for those who use the tunnels. Well, I can answer again. In setting the fares for bus routes, we have not really considered whether or not they would use a particular tunnel. Basically, the fare is set on the basis of distance. So whether they use a particular tunnel does not have any bearing on the fare level. In particular, for the same operator, if the distance is the same, then the fare will be the same, irrespective of whether or not they use a particular tunnel. And therefore, if we just reduce the fare for routes that use particular tunnels, and not the others not using the tunnels, then that would lead to a discrepancy in terms of the fares to be charged by the operator. I'm not asking you to increase or reduce the fare for a particular route, but then for any money that can come from this toll waiver, well, you should have used that on the needy passengers, for example, students and also those who ride on long-haul routes. So you should identify the targets and give them the waiver. I'm not asking you to reduce the fares for routes that use those tunnels. Well, as I said, bus operators do have pressure to increase their fares, even without this fund to reduce the pressure. They genuinely have pressure to increase fares. That's why, as I said, that will be dealt with separately. So for any fare increase applications, those will be dealt with on their own merits, and then this will be used separately. But then as tunnel tolls are part of their operating costs, and if you take it out and say that instead of passing it on to all passengers and it should only be used on certain passengers, then to a certain extent it's not fair. But then with the setting up of a fund, if the total exceeds 10% of the total fare revenue, then it will not be used to offset any fare increase. Then we will ask the operator to use the surplus to distribute it to the passengers, and usually we would discuss with the bus operators as to who should benefit. For example, for the city bus, they have more routes going to the airport. Then we would suggest that for those using the airport routes, they would benefit more in terms of fare cut. So where there is no need to use the fund to offset any pressure on fare increase, we can use it for other purposes. And then for the needy commuters like students and other disadvantaged groups, those can be considered or discussed on another occasion. And honestly, as the chair and other members have said, we have also given you the figures. In fact, if you look at the percentage of tunnel tolls in terms of the total operating cost, is only about 2 to 3%. Yes, you might say that several $100 million is a lot, but then if you look at the whole picture, the full picture, it's not that much. And then as the fare adjustment mechanism or the fare structure is such that it would be best if we can just reduce it across the board. I think that would be the fairest approach. For the other problems, we can consider that on another occasion or at another forum. All right, you're talking about road tunnels, that is CAP 368. So for the Thailand tunnel and also WHC, upon the expiry of the current franchise, they will also be covered by this ordinance. And whatever tunnel is to be built, and if the administration intends to charge a toll, then they will also automatically be covered by this ordinance. So for any proposed road tunnels that are toll charging, then they will be covered, and there is no need for us to discuss that again. Is that right? Yes, theoretically yes, but then they would also have to come up with an amendment regulation to amend it, right? Do you know the question? That is when the WHC and also the TLT, when the franchises expire, the CAP 368 will directly cover them, and there is no need for this council to scrutinize them, and there is no need to move any amendment regulation. Is that right? I think they need to table an amendment regulation to cover it. In other words, we will still need to scrutinize this, including the fund, because in the future, WHC and also TLT, they are rather costly when it comes to tunnel tolls. And we should have the power to reject any proposal to waive the tunnel tolls for WHC and TLT for the bus operators. Is that right? Because there is no point in us putting public money into that fund if it's going to benefit the operator in the end. Yes, for the WHC and TLT, they are not going to be covered on this occasion. And upon the expiry of the franchises, we are not going to directly waive the tunnel tolls for these two tunnels. There is a need for us to move a separate amendment regulation or legislation if we were to do that. Yes, as you can see, in 2023, WHC's franchise will expire. So, do you need to amend this legislation or other piece of legislation or what? Well, legal advisor. Yes, if you can look at the markup copy. That is CAP 368A. All right. They are now adding subclause 4. That is to waive the tolls on franchise bus operators. But then if you look at 1, 2, 3 or 3A, with regard to the tunnel tolls to be imposed on bus operators, all right, 1, 2, 3 have already set out the government tunnels, that is the government tunnels. And then 3A, if WHC and TLT were to be covered by the by Cap 368, they will have to add another clause in order to cover them, and that would require this council's approval. So this council will be able to scrutinize that. But then for subclause 4, there is no need for them to move it again. Chairman, if it's to be an amendment regulation in the future, then when we look at subsidiary legislation, if it's just technical in nature, then we would just approve it without making any objection to it. But then if it's about a toll waiver, then it's no longer technical in nature. It's an extension or variation of the existing policy. And the process itself would also require detailed or careful scrutiny. So it's not like it's done automatically. Yes, I have a question, Chairman. Yes, James Tien. Yes, I'd like to ask the administration this. Would this proposed legislation is unconditional as far as the bus operators are concerned? So you just waive the tunnel tolls, for example, during the past few years. Well, if they are making a profit, and of course, if it exceeds 9.7%, they will have to rebate you. And you can also reduce the proposed increase and so on. But then, does it have anything to do with the tunnel tolls? For example, if they are making a profit, and if they've been making a profit for several years, then they would not be given this toll waiver. You will have to explain again, I'm afraid. Yes, thank you, Chairman. But we have already reached an agreement with the bus operators in principle, so the dedicated fund will be packed to the waiving of the tunnel tolls, and that will come into effect on the same day. In fact, we have indeed waived their tunnel tolls, but then if they make a profit or if there is no pressure on fare increase, then there is a cap on the fund, and if the accumulated total exceeds a certain cap, then the excess will have to be rebated to the commuters. And as I said, out of the 6 franchise bus operators, 5 are asking for a fare increase. And therefore, in order to reduce the fare increase, the fund will have to be used very expeditiously. And also, if you look at the cost structure of the operators, all right, in the past it has been on the high side, and in the future, if they're able to reduce it, as we would be checking their accounts on a regular basis, and for an extended period of time, if they've been able to make a profit because the cost has come down, then there is no need for them to increase the fare. Then we would just take back the exemption. All right, if they are able to make a profit of 2% and they have not exceeded the 9.7 permitted rate of return, all right, they will still be able to ask for a fare increase. So it's not that there is an increase in cost and therefore they can ask for a fare increase, but then they're running a business. So if they are able to make a profit of 1% every year, so every year they can ask for a fare increase. That's the theory, right? So will you still be offering the tunnel toll exemption? So that's very simple. All right, for 5 years in a row, they are only able to make a profit of 1%. So does it mean that you will have to waive the toll for 5 years? All right, let's say if they're making a profit of 1%, do we allow them to increase fares? That's one consideration. But then, if you don't mind, let me replay part of my answer. All right, when they apply for a fare hike, they will only be able to do so by a smaller margin. All right, you're talking about the future. Let's say if they're only able to have a 1% profit margin, so that would account for 2%. Well, let's say the tunnel toll would account for 2% of the cost. So instead of increasing the fare, if their profit margin is only 1%, it would be hard for us to take away the benefit from the tunnel toll waiver, because if we were to take it away, then they would only be able to make a loss. They can only make a loss of 1%, so that would not be good for them. And that will also not be good for us and the public. And therefore, we will not be taking the waiver away. So that will continue. And if they make more than 2% profit, let's say if it's 7, 8% or even 10%, all right, let's say it's 3%, all right, tunnel toll will account for 2% of the operating costs. If we can confirm that, well, under our present proposal, I understand your proposal, okay? If we can confirm that they are actually making more profit now, or if they are able to make a steady profit under the circumstances, let's say for a particular year, let's say if they're able to make 9.7% in terms of profit, then they will of course have to rebate the public. All right, they're actually doing a very good business.
You're talking about two extremes. Either it is 1%, in which case you will not take away the exemption. For 9.7%, you will take away the exemption. We're not sure about the extremes. I'm talking about the 3-4% profit. You will continue with exemption. If they make profits for certain years, but not to the extreme situation, will you take away the exemption? In theory, we don't really want to take away the exemption and increase the fare hike pressure. You refer to the 3-4% profit. It is unlikely that this will be taken away. But you do have the power, don't you? The power lies in your hands. We will reach an agreement with the bus operators. Ultimately, the power lies in our hands. Whether there will be a fare hike is in the government's hand. We would look at it from the public point of view. If we take away the exemption, then it would add to the fare hike pressure. In other words, for the toll exemption, if they will need to have a fare hike, you would allow them the exemption. If they don't make an application, or if they make an application and you allow them a very small percentage, they don't need to count on this, and then you don't grant them the exemption, and it would be decided upon year on year, and they don't have any say. Is it the case that is entirely in the hands of the government, or in the whole process of fare hike application, will this be taken into account? Well, in the fare hike application, we would have regard a host of factors like their views and so on. We would separate the two. You mentioned year by year. Of course, there would be some stability at the very beginning. Now, there is a trend in terms of costs. If we say that the exemption will not be granted next year, it would be very hard for them. We're not going to do this year by year. Regarding the exemption, we will look at the trend of the costs. Okay, then let's press on with the clause by clause. 237, legal notice. I'm done with that. Any questions? No question. The next one is Tsing Sha Control Area Tolls Fees and Charges Amendment Regulation 2018. Number 1, commencement, 17th of February 2019. Number 2, Tsing Sha Control Area Tolls Fees and Charges Regulation amended, and it is amended set out in Section 3. Number 3, Section 3 amended after Section 3.4. We add 4A, buses in respect of which a franchise is enforced under the Public Bus Services Ordinance are exempted from the operation of Section 1, and accordingly no toll is payable for the use of the Lantau link. The third one is 239, legal notice, Tsing Sha Control Area, Tolls, Fees and Charges Amendment Regulation 2018. Number 1, commencement, 17th of February 2019. Number 2, Tsing Sha Control Area Tolls, Fees and Charges Regulation amended as set out in Section 3. And number 3, Section 3 amended. Add 5 buses in respect of which a franchise is enforced under the Public Bus Services Ordinance are exempted from the operation of subsection 1, and accordingly no toll is payable for the use of the toll area. No comments? Legal advisor? No? All right, the legislative timetable. This extension has been sought. Just a reminder that for amendments, it should be no later than the 16th of January 2019. We will submit a report to the House on the 11th of January 2019. I've got a question for the legal advisor. So there are 2 directions. We are likely to extend this to non-franchised buses. For the Tsing Sha control area, there are views that there should be a reduction in the toll for all kinds of vehicles. If we want to make amendments to these, are we allowed to do so under the long title? I think we have to look at the charging effect. Yes, there is a charging effect. Without the CE's approval, it would be impossible because this would have a charging effect. I submit this to the President first. Yes, you can submit the amendments before the deadline. It's entirely up to the President to decide. Date of next meeting, I don't think we need any follow-up meeting. Chairman, if we need discussion on the amendments, is there any way for us to do so? There is a charging effect. You need the endorsement of the Chief Executive. It's the prerogative of the President. Any other business? No AOB item. All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you all very much.